Welcome.
Thank
Dr.
you.
Kshama,
Thank you for having me here.
Thank you for
It's
being
such
here.
a pleasure to have you. I also want to acknowledge you for coming to the memorial for the Ethiopians that had been killed during the IS, also in South Africa during that very
It was
sad and
very tragic.
tragic. Yeah. But it meant a lot to have you there representing our community.
Yes, it was important for me to be there, both as an elected official and as a fellow immigrant. And really, what happened, the tragic incidents that happened, it really are a reminder that we who are on the receiving end of economic inequality and exploitation, we have a strong link globally, regardless of our skin color or nationality. And we have a common duty to really address the problems in society.
Thank you. And we completely agree. We're going to take a moment to get to know our very own Dr. Kshama Sawant. And I say doctor because she has a PhD, and of course in the Ethiopian community, as we like to respect our peers as well as our elders, we'll say Miss, Mrs., Mr., or Doctor. And so you have a PhD background. Can you tell us a little bit?
Yes, I grew up in Mumbai in India, and I initially went into engineering school because mathematics was my favorite subject. But in reality, my whole childhood and my teenage years, I was primarily preoccupied with thinking about poverty and inequality, and it really was, I guess it's fair to say it was an obsession with me, because I could not for the life of me understand why there was any poverty at all. And I grew up in India, observing a tremendous poverty and deprivation and oppression. But for me, the question was, how is it possible that we have so much deprivation and violence and oppression when it was clear that the world, the human society, had more than enough resources and more than enough intelligence to solve all these problems? So it was clear to me that there were systemic reasons. So later on, when I was thinking about what I should do with my life after college, I felt compelled to go into economics, and that's where I got my PhD, and that's how I got my PhD in economics. But there's a sort of a funny story behind it. I never call myself doctor, because I want what I say to be an acknowledgement of something many people are thinking about. You don't have to have a PhD in economics to know that there are deep systemic problems in our society. There is deep inequality. And even in a wealthy city like Seattle, we're seeing poverty rates go up. We are seeing homelessness go up every day. And we are seeing entire communities, the indigenous community, the African American community, the African immigrant community, and other immigrant communities of color being marginalized, even though this city is producing more millionaires. And so I want to make sure that everybody feels like they have a role to play. And ultimately, if we don't build broad-based movements of many people, whether you have your PhD or not, we're not going to be able to succeed in making social change.
I have to say, I've been in Seattle about 14 years, and to hear somebody with an accent, and to see a person of color, and to see an immigrant woman is such a rarity, especially in politics, and it's so refreshing. It feels very empowering. And I just want to acknowledge that your being here, outside of just your politics, but just your being, kind of sways, I think, the climate for a lot of young people, and perhaps young women specifically, in terms of knowing where they can go. Their lives can shift and in the ways in which that they choose to serve. So what was it that made you feel that you wanted to serve in this way? Because you could have lived anywhere, you could have had a very successful career anywhere, but what is it that led you to Seattle politics?
That's a very good question, and I think a lot of what I might share about my own life, I think a lot of people will be able to relate. There's really nothing special other than the fact that I was, like I'm sure many young people around us, and I'm sure yourselves have been thinking about the state of the world. And I never intended to run for office. What I wanted to do was to be an activist. And for many years in search of a group of people, an organization to belong to, because I knew just instinctively, not that anybody taught me this in school or anything like that, but I knew it instinctively that if we are to have a real impact on society and address the questions that face us, like poverty, like climate change, and questions like that, I knew that you can't have an impact just by yourself, just by good intentions. I mean, just because I feel compelled to change, I won't be able to do it myself on my own. And individualized action does not work. It really has to be collective action. But then collective action has to be organized, and really geared towards success. And so I came to Seattle for personal reasons because my former partner also moved here. But when I came here, one thing that happened was in 2009, I attended a meeting that was organized by Socialist Alternative, which is a nationwide organization of social and economic justice activists. And when I heard one of the speakers from Socialist Alternative talk about what their ideas were, it really resonated with me. And I joined Socialist Alternative in 2009. And since then, I haven't looked back. And I mention all of this to share with everybody who's watching this that for me, running for office was not my individual decision. And as a matter of fact, I don't know if I would want to if it was left to me, because I don't know that I wanted to be a public figure. But we all have to play our part. And really, it came about when we, as a democratic organization, were thinking about in 2012 and 2013, everybody's looking for an alternative to corporate policy. Look at the opinion polls from people, 60% of Americans say we need an alternative to the Democratic and Republican establishments, because we know that despite genuine people in the Democratic Party, both party establishments are beholden to Wall Street interests, and they are responsible for the gutting of welfare, for the fact that we don't really have true comprehensive immigration reform. We don't have so many things that we could have, because this is such a wealthy country. It's the wealthiest country in the world. And we wanted to demonstrate an alternative to corporate politics. What does truly a grassroots campaign and a grassroots candidate look like? But it was a democratic decision by a number of people, and who the candidate should be was also a democratic decision, not my personal decision. And I mentioned that specifically because I want everybody to think about what that looks like. Politics, where we don't have candidates running because they want to amplify their own careers and their own personalities, and they're doing it for self-aggrandizement, but instead they are part of an organized movement where the movement tells you, you have to do this for the movement. That's how our campaign came about. That's how it came about that I became a candidate in the first place. And I want this message to be spread, because young people should start thinking about, how do we get organized? This is a very serious question facing us. We're not going to be able to solve the problems we want to solve unless we all come together. And really the question we are raising is that we need an independent organization nationally that fights for, not for Wall Street.
Very well said. So you are the voice of the underrepresented minority, the youth, and people of color, and the champion behind the $15 per hour wage increase in Seattle. And I want to ask, and I want to feel you to keep going, and what are some of the challenges that you face when fighting for the common good?
I think the $15 minimum wage is a great example that you brought up of how people, when they get organized into movements that are raising concrete demands, specific demands, not in the abstract, but $15 an hour is a very specific demand that we want. It's really a live example of how we can accomplish social change. And the main thing that keeps me going as an individual, as a person, is my unflinching faith in working people like myself, that we all have the power to change society, and have to imagine it. History is full of examples of how ordinary working people, when they come out and become a part of an organized struggle, we can make massive changes. And $15 an hour is the most recent one of the most recent examples. But if you look at how the civil rights for for the African American community, for the black community was one, how women won the right to vote in this country and in every other country, how marriage equality was one. All of these struggles represent in every era, they represent working people coming out in thousands, tens of thousands, millions, and demanding social change. And I think that because I know that that happens and I know that we can have an impact, that keeps me going.
Well, your passion resonates beyond this room. It just like beyond the walls, and I'm not just making that up, right? Isn't that exciting?
Yeah.
For me, as somebody who grew up saying to my mom, we grew up and we were like reversed. I should have been, your age in the 60s and 70s, and you should have been my age in the 80s and 90s, is what I used to tell her, because I was always so moved by the civil rights movement and by the ordinary people's efforts to create the changes that we are actually enjoying today, including the studio, including the diversity of workforce,
and for us as women to be playing this role, having a political conversation. All three of us are women.
Exactly.
It's a huge,
and it's really exciting. So just a little fun little question. Maybe it's just for me, but in all the civil rights and political geeks out there, do you feel like this political climate is just dead? Is it silent? Is it apathetic? Or, as somebody had recently said, I feel like we are back to where we were during the civil rights movement, upon being and observing the work of Grace Lee Boggs, who just rest,
May she rest in peace. Yeah.
How's the word?
May she rest in peace.
May she rest in peace. Yes. But are we just done with that, or do you feel like this is a resurgence from Black Lives Matter to everything that you're talking about? Like, is it all done, or are we in a resurgence, or has it just?
That's a very, very important question. Let me start with, first of all, just on a personal level, acknowledging what you said earlier, that you felt like I felt like you were saying that I felt like I was born in the wrong era, I should have been born. I just wanted to acknowledge that that's exactly how I felt. I mean, I'm also a product of the 80s and 90s, and I used to think all the time, man, I should have been born in the 60s and 70s, because it was the 60s and 70s were a tremendously struggle and many successes for working class struggles, for women's struggles, for Native American struggles. Also the ending of the Vietnam War, which was a phenomenal movement of young people, many of them college students, Vietnam War veterans and so on. And it's true that after, and there's a reason why people like us feel that way, is because after the 70s, in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, there was a decline of activism, and it was sort of in that period, it was, I would call it the neoliberal era. Globally, there was a real clamp down from the political establishment and the business establishment on activism. In the 80s, for example, in the United States, under the Reagan administration, there were vicious attacks against unions, labor unions, and the American labor movement has a proud history. That's why, because of them, we have the 8-hour workday and the weekend, and many rights, especially for women and people of color. And all those labor movements were actually the people who fought in those labor movements came from various countries. They were multi-ethnic, multinational, really. The people who fought in that, and they fought together because they were united in a class struggle. But after that, after those eras, there was a downslide, and in fact, I would say that we have inherited a decimated activist layer, and it's our job to revive it. But it's absolutely true that we are now coming into a similar era. It's by no means ended. It's only the beginning. The winning of $15 an hour in Seattle is a sign of things to come. resurgence of black activism through the Black Lives Matter movement is another very, very important sign, perhaps the important sign right now of the times, stepping into an era of what I think will be massive social, but it's not, none of that is guaranteed. What's true and what exists right now is a latent anger and frustration at the status quo, especially for young people who have come into a world where they're facing, for the most part, unless you're very, very fortunate to have been born in a privileged family, for the most part, our younger generation is facing a future of low-wage jobs, student debt that has now climbed over $1 trillion in this country. We're facing a world that has been ravaged by climate change and urgently needs a shift to renewable energy. We're facing a massive increase in poverty and homelessness. We have renewed attacks against women's rights. All that is true, and there is an anger against it, and people want to fight back. What's not guaranteed is that anger and frustration can be transformed into organized struggles that can really bring about change, and that's where we have to be intentional about it. Unless we actually understand that we are stepping into an era where there is a big opening for the left, unless we recognize that movements in a very conscious way, we won't win those successes. We won't be able to change the world. And that's why it's important not to miss this moment. What you said is very important, because unless we know, yes, this is happening, we won't grab that moment. And it is so important for us to do that. That is why we take everything we do on the city council seriously. So we won 15, but we had no intention to stop there. People are so empowered by a victory. And that's been for decades, and that sense of victory we can transform into, many, many other victories.
Awesome.
Very nice. So you kind of touched upon a question that I was going to ask, and it's, as an introduction, as you said earlier, you said you were a software engineer in India, and now you're one of the leading activists in Seattle. And you understand a lot of the people here in Seattle or around the globe and in the United States face. And I was just going to ask, for young people who look at you, what are some of your motivational words? I think you touched some of that in your...
Yeah. I mean, that's a very important thing to identify what the role of young people is. First of all, I would say, you can't make change if you're a passive observer. You have to get involved. Mm-hmm. But how to get involved is also an important question. So just to give concrete examples of how this can be done, when we launched our campaign for City Council in 2013, we made $15 an hour the most prominent part of our campaign platform. But what we did through the campaign itself, through our election campaign itself, was go out into the community and bring young people into the campaign, but not just for election purposes, but to empower them into themselves taking the message of $15 an hour to other young people like themselves. And really, there were many, many people who played an important role. The labor movement played an important role in winning $15 an hour. The faith community, people of every faith, were part of the leadership of pushing for 15 and saying that this is a moral obligation our society has to make sure that 100,000 workers in Seattle who are stuck in poverty are lifted out of it. But perhaps the most powerful dollars an hour was that of young workers, people who are young in their late teens, 20s, 30s, but have been stuck in low-wage jobs for a long time and have, other than social movements, they have no hope of moving out of poverty. And when they came into the rallies and the protest marches, if you talk to them, and I talked to many, many of them, they will tell you that it wasn't just about themselves. What brought them, the first thing that brought them, of course, was being able to make a material change in their life. But when you come out in a struggle like this with so many other people like yourself, you realize I'm not the only one. And that feeling of solidarity, I think, was very, very important for younger workers to see that we can really fight against this kind of entrenched inequality. We can fight big business, and that's truly inspiring, because when we won 15, not because big business representatives suddenly became nice and said, oh, yeah, you're right, it's wrong that you're living in poverty, let's make a change. Nail against 15, and young workers had to fight against that, and winning despite the opposition by big business is so empowering. Now young people have to say, we need to build this movement further. And I would say in Seattle, affordable housing is probably one of the main issues we should tackle. But we have to bring in the question of corporate politics as well, because if we want to empower the younger generation by showing, by winning social change on many fronts, to show that this can be done, we are going to, and we have already come up against corporate politics, the money and influence of big business. So even in this election year, you can see that the candidates that are bankrolled by big business are not going to be the ones who are fighting for young people. So young people have also to have to educate themselves and understand, what's going on in this election year, who's really on my side, and who's paying lip service to the issues that affect me, but are not really on my side. They're on the side of big developers and big corporations, and that is a big part of our education, of our movement.
Well, speaking of young people, one of the reasons that we have this studio is to make sure that everybody feels like they have a right to their voice. And of course, media is one of those tools that they can employ, and it's probably the most powerful tool nowadays, right?
Yeah, very true.
Yeah, so they come in and they get to learn how to use the cameras, as well as edit, as well as just finalize the story. But what is the story that they want to tell? I'm constantly concerned about the bridge building that's happening within our different climates, I'll call it that. So young people are obviously, everybody says, the children are the leaders, the children are the leaders, our youth are our leaders, but we're not really doing, I don't think, enough. I mean, I think our young people, especially immigrant youth, end up carrying a huge weight, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
A lot of times they're the translators. For times they have to quit school in order to go to work so that they can support their family. Many times they are, again, missing either from school or work to take care of younger siblings and such. How can they get involved in a very practical way in movements that allows for the changes that they desire for their own families and communities, do you think?
I think one of the things that one of the messages that needs to get across to everybody, but especially young people who are looking to get politically involved, is that whatever, we all have our own personal experiences, and what got one of us politicized, what got one of us thinking about why I should get involved may be different than some others. It may be something that you experienced in your workplace, it may be something that you experienced in your home country, it varies. But at the end of the day, I think it's extremely important for us to recognize that whatever it is that we feel most strongly about, whether maybe young people feel most strongly about immigrant rights, maybe some feel most strongly about the lack of good paying jobs, but whatever those individual things might be, I think it's very important, I would say critical, that we all get, especially young people, we get engaged in the movement that is happening around us at this moment. So the reason I say that is because unless we win concrete victories on many, many things, we're not going to be able to build a movement strong enough that will deal with all of those things that people are worried about. So what I mean by this is, concretely, is to say is that perhaps young people are thinking about the racial injustice in schools, the dropout rates that our immigrant communities face, and the lack of real opportunity to get higher education, to get well-paying jobs and so on. But at this moment, if we see a movement around affordable housing and rent control, or tenant rights, if we see that emerging, it is absolutely important that young people get involved in it. Even if you are living with your parents and you are not paying the rent check, you still should get involved. And the reason is, first of all, we're not going to win victories on affordable housing and housing justice unless young people get involved. And secondly, it's because we will win victories on these things, it will help us build a movement further that will go, I have no doubt, go ahead and tackle other questions that are of maybe of most immediate necessity for other young people. So if we win victories on housing justice, there is no question that we will be able to build our movement further to fight against student debt, to fight for fight to reduce tuition in college, to fight for apprenticeship programs, for a public works program that will create unionized living wage jobs. I mean, there's a lot to be done, but it's important that we get involved right now.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I mean, as a first generation college graduate, I can understand the points that you're making. Like, for instance, as I was growing up, if my parents were there, if like my uncle was there, to help me out with my homework. If the rent wasn't so high, he wouldn't be working so hard.
That's true.
Right?
Yeah,
and he would be there to help me out.
So it has an impact on your life.
It has a huge impact on my life.
Yeah.
Or if he went to college, I think that the consequence, would have been a little different.
Yeah,
most
it's
definitely.
It's absolutely true. Yeah, everything is linked. It's not just one thing or another that's wrong in our society. These are fundamental problems, and they're related. Racial injustice is very much tied to economic injustice, which is very much tied to social injustice or even gender injustice. So when women, we need to fight for gender, to end the gender pay gap. We need to fight for a 12-week paid parental leave. But we need to link these struggles to other struggles as well, because the only way we will win on any of these things is if we fight together and we build our movement even stronger. There's another important reason why young people should get involved right now in our movement for affordable housing and other movements that are emerging in Seattle and the Black Lives Matter movement. And that is because unless we all, and it's not specific to young people, anybody who wants to win in a political struggle needs to learn how to win. And so experience in a live political struggle, like $15 an hour, is extremely important. There is no textbook that I could recommend that young people can open and say, what are the strategies and tactics you can use to build a successful organized movement? How do you spread your message to workers when big businesses lies about how 15 would be bad? We had to fight against all those negative messages. Yeah. How do you build a movement that is strong enough to withstand all of that? There's no formula for that. And in every struggle, you're going to have to employ different tactics and strategies. And the only way to understand how to do that is to be part of a real movement. To do it many times, and then we develop our own skills as political organizers. And you know what? There is never any, when we start on an organized movement, like $15 an hour, there's never any guarantee that we're going to win. We didn't know we were going to win, but we knew one thing: if we didn't fight, we're never going to make a change. Hi, sisters and brothers. I'm Kshama Sawant. I'm on the Seattle City Council. I'm also a member of Socialist Alternative. And you might know that we are in a really exciting period of political change in Seattle. We've just won the historically high minimum wage, $15 an hour last year. We're also making huge gains in affordable housing and housing justice for everybody. But we have a long way to go. And it's really, really important that you all get involved. And it's great work that MMRTI is doing here, having a media center, a truly grassroots media center, and using their media resources specifically with the goal of engaging youth in political activism. And it's really important that they're doing this. And I urge everybody who's watching this, please get involved. Let's fight for a better world.